The sky wept as the casket descended. Dark clouds hung low, the steady drizzle soaking the earth, mixing with the fresh-turned soil of the open grave. Malik Carter stood motionless, his black suit drenched, water dripping from his tightly clenched fists. He wasn't just standing at his brother's funeral. He was standing at the edge of his own breaking point. Jamal was gone, his big brother, his protector, the one person who never let the world push him around. And now Malik had to say goodbye. But how did you say goodbye to someone who wasn't supposed to be gone? His breath hitched as the casket lowered, the pulleys groaning under its weight. Tears burned in his eyes, but he refused to blink. He wouldn't break, not here, not in front of them. A few feet away, his father, Elijah Carter, stood like a statue. His face was unreadable, dark brown eyes locked on the casket, his hands folded in front of him. Where Malik's grief was raw, his father's was cold, calculated. The grief of a man who had learned long ago that emotions had no place in a battlefield. And today, this funeral was a battlefield. Then a voice sliced through the air like a rusted blade. "There he is!" A sharp, nasal tone, condescending, drenched in arrogance. Malik's stomach twisted as he turned to see HOA President Karen Holloway standing at the edge of the crowd, flanked by two uniformed police officers. She wore a beige designer coat, perfectly pristine despite the rain-soaked ground. Her icy blue eyes scanned the mourners with thinly veiled disgust, as if their very presence offended her. Beside her, the two officers shifted uncomfortably, their hands hovering near their belts. Malik felt his father stiffen beside him. "Not here, not now." Karen's lips curled into a tight, practiced smirk as she pointed a perfectly manicured finger straight at Malik. "That one, he's trespassing." The entire funeral froze. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. People exchanged confused, angry glances. Even the priest, who had been preparing for the final prayer, hesitated mid-sentence. Malik's jaw clenched. "What?" Karen took a slow step forward, the wet grass squishing beneath her heels. "You don't live here anymore, Malik." She said his name like it was a curse. "This is a private community event, and we have rules. You know that." A cold rage burned in Malik's chest. This wasn't about rules. He had lived in this neighborhood his whole life. But Karen Holloway had been waiting for an opportunity to remind him, and everyone else, who really held the power. The officers hesitated. The older of the two, a stocky white man with graying hair, shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, this is a funeral." Karen didn't flinch. "I don't care. He's a non-resident. That makes him a trespasser." Malik's hands curled into fists. His brother was in the ground, and this woman had the audacity. "Arrest him!" The words crashed into him like a sledgehammer. The crowd erupted. "Are you serious? This is a funeral. He belongs here more than you do, Karen." Karen's expression didn't change. She thrived on this. The older officer exhaled sharply. "Son, you need to come with us." Malik laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "This is my brother's funeral," he said, voice low but sharp as broken glass. "You think I'd give a damn about your HOA?" The officer shifted, looking uncertain. But before he could speak, Karen leaned in. "Resisting won't help you, Malik." And just like that, Malik felt a firm hand grab his wrist. His world snapped. The rage boiled over. Malik jerked his arm back, stepping away, but the younger officer was already moving. A rough shove, cold metal, a sharp click. Handcuffs, gasps, screams. The priest yelled in protest. Malik's wrists burned as he struggled. "You're arresting me at my brother's funeral?" The older officer hesitated again. He knew this wasn't right. He knew it. But Karen was watching, her arms crossed, her eyes gleaming. Malik looked around. Everyone was watching. His father still hadn't moved. "Elijah," a woman whispered near him. "Do something." But Elijah Carter remained still. Dead serious, calculating, watching. Malik's heart pounded. Why wasn't his father stepping in? Karen smirked, stepping forward until she was just a breath away from Elijah Carter. "I hope you understand, Mr. Carter. Rules are rules. Elijah finally turned his gaze toward her, and for the first time Karen hesitated. His eyes were ice cold, his expression unreadable. But there was something in his presence, a quiet, simmering storm ready to break. And then, in a voice so calm it was terrifying, Elijah finally spoke. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Karen frowned. "Excuse me?" Elijah tilted his head slightly, watching her like a lion watches prey. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Karen's smirk wavered, but just for a second. She scoffed. "I don't care who you are," she said. "This is my community." Elijah gave her one last look before turning his attention back to Malik, who was now being pulled toward the police car. Then he pulled out his phone and dialed. The officers didn't know it yet. Karen didn't know it yet. But the second Elijah Carter made that call, their entire world had just started to fall apart. The rain fell harder as Malik was dragged toward the police car, his wrists still bound in cold steel. The rough grip of the officer burned against his skin, but his rage burned hotter. The funeral crowd erupted. Angry voices filled the cemetery. "You can't do this! This is a funeral, not a crime scene. Let the boy go." But Karen Holloway didn't flinch. She stood tall, arms crossed, her chin slightly raised, soaking in the chaos she had created. This was control. This was power. The older officer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but the younger one, a muscular white cop with a square jaw, didn't blink. He was used to this. Used to following orders without thinking. Malik fought against their grip. "This is my brother's funeral, man. What the hell is wrong with you?" The younger officer barely glanced at him. "Calm down." "Calm down?" Malik's voice cracked with disbelief. "You're arresting me for standing at my own brother's grave." The older officer sighed, shifting uncomfortably. "Look, kid, we're just following HOA rules." The words hit Malik like a punch to the gut. "HOA rules?" He yanked his arms, stepping forward, his breath ragged with frustration. "Do I look like I give a damn about your HOA right now?" The younger cop shoved him back. Malik stumbled, his shoes skidding against the wet grass. A fresh wave of gasps swept through the mourners. The older officer winced. Karen smiled. She loved this. Her perfectly manicured fingers tightened around her designer coat as she turned toward the gathered mourners, as if she was the victim here. "This is exactly the kind of behavior we're trying to prevent in our community," she announced loudly, her voice smooth, controlled, but dripping with venom. A murmur of disbelief spread through the crowd. Malik felt his blood boil. "What the hell did you just say?" Karen tilted her head slightly, feigning innocence. "Oh, don't act so surprised, Malik. You never did fit in here." A sharp, bitter laugh bubbled up in Malik's chest. "Lady, I lived here." Karen's smirk didn't fade. "And yet you're still trespassing." Through all the chaos, Elijah Carter stood completely still. The rain rolled off his dark overcoat, his face unreadable. His deep brown eyes flicked over the scene before him, analyzing every movement, every word. He watched as his only living son was shoved into the back of a police car. He watched as the officers ignored the mourners' outrage. He watched as Karen stood there gloating. And yet, he did nothing. Not a word, not a single protest. He simply adjusted his tie. The funeral crowd noticed. "Why isn't he saying anything?" Someone whispered. "Elijah, what are you doing?" Even Karen seemed momentarily puzzled. She had expected a reaction, expected outrage. Instead, Elijah Carter simply watched. And then he turned. Without a single glance at Malik or the officers, he walked away. The moment he left, Karen Holloway exhaled sharply, shaking her head. Some people just don't know when they've lost. The older officer glanced at her. "Ma'am, are you sure about this? This is a funeral." Karen shot him a sharp look. "I don't pay you to ask questions." The younger cop stiffened. "She's right. The kid broke HOA regulations. That's all that matters." Karen smiled. There it was. the blind obedience she had built her power on. She turned back toward the funeral crowd, soaking in their horror, their disbelief. This was why she had become HOA president, for control. She had been running this neighborhood for years, and in all that time she had made it her mission to keep it exactly the way she wanted. Perfect, quiet, white. She had shut down black-owned businesses. She had fined black homeowners for violations while ignoring white residents doing the same things. She had blocked black families from buying houses, always politely, always within the rules. And now she had just humiliated Elijah Carter's son in front of an entire community. And the best part? She had the law on her side. Karen turned away from the crowd and pulled out her phone. "The problem is handled," she spoke softly into the receiver. "Send out the HOA bulletin. Make it clear that we don't tolerate rule breakers." She hung up, smiling. Inside the police cruiser, Malik sat in silence. His hands were still cuffed, the cold metal biting into his skin. The inside of the car smelled like sweat and stale coffee, the police radio crackling softly in the background. Why hadn't his father done anything? Elijah Carter was one of the most powerful civil rights attorneys in the state. He had gone head-to-head with corrupt politicians, exposed police brutality, and yet today he had just walked away. Malik's jaw clenched. His father never backed down from a fight. What the hell was he planning? The car slowed as they pulled into the police station. The station was small, dimly lit, the kind of place that smelled like bad decisions and cheap air freshener. The older cop glanced at Malik through the rearview mirror. For the first time, there was uncertainty in his eyes. Maybe he had realized what they had just done. Maybe he knew deep down that this wasn't justice. The younger officer? He was all business. He opened the car door. "Let's go." Malik exhaled slowly and stepped out, the rain still pouring. As they led him inside, his father's last words echoed in his head. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." What did he mean? Malik's heart pounded. Something was coming, something big. And Karen Holloway had no idea what storm she had just unleashed. The air inside the police station was thick with the stench of sweat and old coffee. Malik Carter sat on a cold metal bench, his wrists still sore from the handcuffs. His dress shirt was damp, the rainwater now mixing with the frustration and simmering beneath his skin. He had just buried his brother. And now he was in a holding cell for trespassing. Malik's jaw clenched as he leaned his head back against the cinder block wall. This wasn't about rules. This was about power. And Karen Holloway had just reminded him who she thought really held it. A grizzled desk sergeant walked in, holding a clipboard, his expression blank. "Malik Carter," he read, flipping through the paperwork. Malik didn't respond. The sergeant sighed. "You've been charged with criminal trespassing and resisting arrest," Malik scoffed. "Resisting arrest? I was at my brother's funeral." The sergeant didn't even look up. "According to the HOA, the cemetery is considered private community property, and since you're no longer a resident, you were in violation of—" Malik laughed bitterly. "You're seriously using HOA bylaws to justify this?" The sergeant set the clipboard down. "Look, kid, it's above my pay grade." "Then tell me who the hell is paying for this bullshit?" The sergeant hesitated, just for a second, before clearing his throat. He knew. He knew this was nonsense, but he also knew better than to question the system. Malik exhaled sharply. This wasn't about him. It never had been. Malik glanced around the holding cell. He wasn't alone. Across from him, a young black boy, couldn't be more than 15, sat curled up against the wall. His hoodie was damp, his eyes bloodshot from crying. Next to him, a tall, lanky black teen tapped his fingers nervously against his knee. Something clicked in Malik's mind. This wasn't a one-time thing. This was a pattern. He leaned forward, catching the tall kid's gaze. "How long you been here?" The kid hesitated before answering. 2 days. 2 days, Malik frowned. "For what?" The kid shrugged bitterly. "HOA says I was a loitering Near a park, Malik's stomach twisted, loitering. The universal excuse for calling the cops on black kids. He turned to the younger boy. "What about you?" The boy sniffled. "They said I vandalized a mailbox. I was just getting my basketball." Malik's hands clenched into fists. Karen Holloway had been doing this for years. This wasn't about HOA rules. This was about systemic racism disguised as community safety. Meanwhile, across town, Karen Holloway sat comfortably in her office. Her nails clicked against her mahogany desk as she scrolled through the latest HOA reports. A satisfied smirk curled at the corner of her lips as she picked up the phone. The line rang twice before a deep male voice answered. "This better be good, Karen." Karen chuckled softly, leaning back in her chair. "Oh, it is," she purred. "I took care of the problem." There was a pause, then a slow, approving hum. "Good. We don't need troublemakers ruining our community." Karen's smirk widened. She lived for this. Maintaining order, keeping people like Malik Carter in their place. "This is why we keep you in charge, Karen." Karen's chest swelled with pride. HOA bylaws weren't just rules to her, they were weapons, and she had just used them to make an example out of Malik Carter. What Karen didn't know, what she couldn't even begin to suspect, was that she had just walked straight into Elijah Carter's trap. As Malik sat in that holding cell, as Karen basked in her own arrogance, Elijah was already making moves. The moment he had walked away from the cemetery, he had placed a single, calculated phone call. Not to a lawyer, not to the police, but to someone much more dangerous. A soft click echoed as the other line picked up. "Elijah Carter," a smooth, sharp voice answered. "Been a while." Elijah's grip on the phone tightened. "I need everything you've got on the Oak Ridge HOA. There was a slight pause, then a chuckle. "Elijah, my man," the voice mused, "you just declared war on a whole system." Elijah stared out over the city skyline, eyes cold, jaw tight. "Then let's burn it to the ground." The police station smelled like sweat, stale coffee, and bureaucracy. A place built to break people. Elijah Carter stepped inside, his polished dress shoes clicking softly against the scuffed linoleum floor. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. The station was alive with quiet murmurs, the low hum of paperwork being processed, officers exchanging stories over half-empty coffee cups. No one looked up when he entered. That was their first mistake. Elijah walked toward the front desk. A tired-looking officer sat behind it, flipping through a stack of files. His uniform was slightly wrinkled, his tie loosened, a steaming cup of bad coffee beside him. He didn't bother looking up. "Take a seat," the officer muttered. Still reading. "Somebody will be with you when they're available." Elijah didn't move. The officer sighed, finally glancing up. The second he locked eyes with Elijah, something shifted. The room felt heavier. Elijah Carter didn't have to raise his voice. He didn't have to make a scene. He was the scene. His presence alone demanded attention. The officer blinked. Something about the man in front of him, his tailored black suit, the unwavering look in his eyes, made his throat suddenly dry. Elijah reached into his pocket, pulled out a sleek, black business card, and placed it on the counter. A soft snick. The officer hesitated, then slowly glanced down. His eyes scanned the gold-embossed letters. U.S. Civil Rights Attorney Elijah Carter. The color drained from his face. The officer straightened in his chair. "Sir, Elijah tilted his head slightly. "I assume my son is in holding." The officer's hands twitched over his paperwork. "Mr. Carter, Elijah held up a single finger. The room fell silent. "There's a body cam recording," Elijah said, his voice smooth, controlled. "It'll show that my son was illegally detained at a funeral. I assume you don't want me to subpoena it?" The officer swallowed hard. "We were just following HOA orders, sir," he stammered. "The report says—" Elijah leaned forward slightly, just enough to make the officer flinch. "The report says my son was trespassing," he said quietly, "at a public cemetery. during his brother's funeral. The officer opened his mouth and shut it. He had nothing. Elijah's fingers tapped against the counter. The charges, he continued, are baseless. The arrest was unlawful, and in about 5 minutes, the NAACP and half the state's civil rights lawyers will be watching every move you make. The officer's hands trembled slightly as he fumbled for his radio. Bring Malik Carter to processing now. Across the room, a second officer, the same one who had handcuffed Malik, overheard the conversation. His face paled. Karen had assured them this was nothing, just another HOA case. But this wasn't nothing. This was Elijah Carter. The officer quickly approached the desk. Sir, we were just acting on the HOA's complaint. If there was a mistake, Elijah's eyes snapped toward him. A mistake? His voice was dangerously calm. You arrested my son at his brother's funeral, in front of mourners, on camera. And you call that a mistake? The officer visibly swallowed. Elijah picked up his business card from the counter, brushing off invisible dust. Let me tell you what's going to happen next, he said. Malik is going to be released. Every charge dropped. The footage will be reviewed. And then we're going to have a very, very public conversation about this precinct's relationship with the HOA. The officers didn't dare look at him. Elijah sighed, shaking his head. Get him out of that cell. Meanwhile, Karen Holloway was sipping champagne. She sat on the patio of her massive 2-story home, watching the rain drip down the marble railing. The HOA board had just sent their weekly meeting minutes. More funding for neighborhood surveillance, increased HOA fines for violations. She smiled. The system worked perfectly. She had just put Malik Carter in his place. In Elijah, he had walked away. No fight, no power moves, nothing. She had won. Her phone buzzed. Unknown caller. Karen frowned. She normally didn't answer unknown numbers, but something felt off. She swiped to accept. Hello? A deep voice, calm and controlled, replied, Karen Holloway. Karen stiffened. Elijah Carter. The glass in her hand suddenly felt heavier. How did you get this number? She asked, forcing her voice to stay even. Elijah chuckled. I have a better question. Do you know how quickly a career can be destroyed? Karen felt her stomach twist. I don't know what you're talking about. Elijah's voice remained steady. I just had a very interesting conversation with the police department. Karen's grip tightened on her phone. Let me be clear, Miss Holloway, Elijah continued. This isn't about HOA policies anymore. This is about civil rights violations, false imprisonment, abuse of power. Karen scoffed, sitting up straighter. You're bluffing. I followed the rules. The HOA is about to be investigated for racial discrimination, misuse of funds, and systemic abuse, Elijah interrupted. Karen's mouth went dry. Elijah exhaled softly. And you, Karen, you just became the face of it all. In another part of the city, news stations were already preparing their headlines. HOA president calls police on black teen at funeral. Civil rights attorney declares war on discriminatory HOA. Social media erupts over illegal arrest. By the time Karen Holloway realized what was happening, it was already too late. The calls from the HOA board started pouring in. Her career was crumbling. Breaking news, HOA president accused of racism. Karen Holloway's world was collapsing. She sat stiffly in her lavish living room, eyes glued to the television screen, hands clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. On the massive flat screen in front of her, a news anchor with perfect hair and a rehearsed expression of outrage spoke in sharp, clipped tones. Tonight, growing outrage over an HOA president's shocking abuse of power. Karen Holloway, head of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association, is facing serious allegations after ordering the arrest of a black teenager at his own brother's funeral. Karen's stomach twisted. The screen cut to footage of Malik Carter, handcuffed in the pouring rain, his face filled with disbelief and pain. Then, another shot. Elijah Carter stepping into the police station, silent, terrifying. The camera zoomed in on his business card on the desk. U.S. Civil Rights Attorney Elijah Carter. The news anchor continued. Carter, a high-profile attorney, has officially filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against Holloway and the HOA, citing racial discrimination and unlawful detainment. Karen shot up from the couch. "This is bullshit," she hissed at the screen. But the segment wasn't over. The next image? A body cam video. And Karen felt the blood drain from her face. The grainy footage played on every major news station, every Twitter feed, every TikTok account. Body cam footage. HOA president calls cops on black teen at funeral. The video started with Karen's smug voice. "There he is. He's trespassing." Then came Malik's reaction, his heartbreak, his fury. The camera shook slightly as the officers hesitated. Even they knew this was wrong. Then came the moment that made the world explode in rage. Karen's voice, clear as day. "We don't need people like him in our community." Boom! The internet erupted. #HOA Karen started trending within an hour. Twitter, X, holy sh*t. This woman really thought she could get away with this? Karen Holloway's HOA is a modern-day Jim Crow system. Burn it down. You just got the Attorney General's son arrested. Your career is over, sweetheart. TikTok. Users reposted the footage with captions. Karen got her villain arc, but she forgot the hero always wins. Elijah Carter about to serve legal revenge, hot and fresh. Instagram. Memes flooded in. Karen's face photoshopped onto historical dictators. One post read, "HOA House of Oppressing Africans." Facebook. Local HOA president exposed for racism. Sign this petition to remove her. Even celebrities started speaking up. A famous NBA player tweeted, "This is why we fight. Karen Holloway needs to be locked up." The entire world was watching. The courtroom was packed. Karen Holloway sat at the defendant's table, her once perfect posture stiff with barely restrained panic. Elijah Carter sat across from her, calm, focused, deadly. He hadn't spoken to her since that phone call, since he told her her career was over. Now he was here to make sure of it. The judge peered over his glasses. "Mr. Carter, proceed." Elijah stood, buttoned his suit, and walked to the center of the room. "Your Honor, today we are not just talking about one illegal arrest." He turned, his piercing gaze locking onto Karen. "We are talking about a system that has for years allowed Karen Holloway to target black residents with impunity." Karen's throat went dry. Then, the final nail in the coffin. Elijah held up a thick file of documents. "These are records of every fine, every complaint, every bias policy issued under her watch." He flipped to a highlighted page. 98% of all HOA violations were issued to black or Latino residents. Karen felt like she couldn't breathe. "Your Honor," Elijah continued, "I move that not only should these charges against my client be dismissed, but that a federal investigation into Oak Ridge HOA's discriminatory practices should begin immediately." The judge leaned back, considering. Then he turned to Karen's lawyer. "Do you have anything to say?" Karen's attorney looked at her, then at the overwhelming evidence. He sighed. "No, Your Honor." Karen's world started to crumble. By the time she left the courtroom, her phone was buzzing nonstop. First came the HOA board members. "Karen, we need to talk. The board is distancing itself from you. The press is killing us. You need to resign." Then came the sponsors of her real estate company. "Oh, due to recent allegations, we are terminating our partnership." Then, her boss. "Karen, your resignation letter better be on my desk by morning." She stood on the courthouse steps, staring at her phone in shock. It was all falling apart. Her power, her reputation, her control. Gone. And standing across the street, watching her with a knowing smirk, Elijah Carter. He didn't say a word. He just tipped his head slightly. A silent "I told you so." And then he walked away. Investigation begins. How deep does this rabbit hole go? Karen Holloway had no idea how bad things were about to get. The courtroom humiliation had been brutal. The social media firestorm had been relentless. But the real nightmare? That was just getting started. The FBI launched an official probe into Oak Ridge HOA within 24 hours of Elijah Carter's lawsuit. And what they found? It wasn't just racism, it was systemic abuse. Investigators dug through years of HOA records. Black and Latino homeowners received 97% of all HOA fines. Black families were denied property approvals 8x more than white families. Dozens of families were forced to sell their homes due to Karen's enforcement. Millions of dollars in HOA funds were missing, misused under Karen's leadership. This wasn't about rules. This was about control, about keeping black families out. And now, the entire system was crumbling. No. 2 days later, federal agents stormed the Oak Ridge HOA headquarters. Files were seized, computers were confiscated, HOA board members were dragged out for questioning. And the biggest moment? Karen Holloway's personal office, her throne, was locked down as evidence. The media caught everything. Cameras flashed as FBI agents carried out boxes of files, marked with big red letters. Fraud, discrimination, civil rights violation. HOA board members panicked. Some tried to distance themselves from Karen. Others started flipping, exposing everything. One former board member even did a TV interview. Karen made all the major decisions. She controlled everything. We should have spoken up sooner. Karen watched it all unfold from her mansion. And for the first time, she was terrified. The courtroom was packed. The media, civil rights activists, politicians, everyone was watching. At the defendant's table, Karen sat pale-faced, her lawyer whispering furiously in her ear. She barely heard him. Across from her, Elijah Carter adjusted his tie, standing tall, controlled, lethal. Beside him, Malik Carter, free, watching. The judge cleared his throat. We have reviewed the findings of the FBI investigation. The level of racial discrimination, fraud, and abuse of power uncovered is staggering. Karen swallowed hard. Effective immediately, Oak Ridge HOA is being dissolved. All illegally issued fines and evictions are to be overturned. A murmur of satisfaction spread through the crowd, but Elijah wasn't done. He slowly stepped forward. Your Honor, while the HOA was a problem, it was a machine, a system. Machines don't run without a leader. He turned, his sharp eyes locked onto Karen. And that leader is sitting right there. Karen's pulse pounded. This court should recognize Karen Holloway's actions as not just unethical, but criminal. Elijah placed a thick file onto the judge's bench. This is evidence of targeted harassment, fraudulent misuse of HOA funds, and civil rights violations spanning over a decade. The courtroom erupted. The judge leaned forward, eyes darkening. Karen Holloway, please rise. She slowly stood. Her knees felt weak. The judge's voice was cold. You are hereby placed under arrest for fraud, illegal discrimination, and abuse of power. The gavel slammed. And just like that, Karen Holloway was no longer the most powerful woman in Oak Ridge. She was just another criminal. As soon as the court was dismissed, 2 officers stepped forward. Clink! The handcuffs snapped onto Karen's wrists, the same way they had on Malik. She gasped. Wait, no, this isn't... The cameras flashed wildly. Karen's own community watched. No sympathy, no support. Just cold, satisfied faces. The same people who once feared her now saw her for what she really was. A fraud, a racist, a disgrace. As she was dragged toward the exit, she locked eyes with Malik. He didn't say a word. He just smiled. But karma wasn't done yet. With the fraud charges in place, Karen's personal finances were investigated. And what did they find? She had stolen from the HOA, used HOA money for her own luxury vacations, bought expensive gifts, jewelry, and home renovations, all illegally funded. And now, she had to pay it all back. Karen's mansion, the same one she had fought to keep pure, was seized by the government. Her cars? Gone. Her bank accounts? Frozen. The same HOA bylaws she once weaponized? Now they were being used to evict her. With nowhere left to go, Karen tried to reach out to her former allies. But the HOA board members had already moved on. The politicians who once supported her refused to take her calls. Even her closest friends stopped answering. She was a liability now. Nobody wanted to be associated with Karen Holloway, the face of racism in America. One last news report sealed her fate. Former HOA president found guilty of fraud and civil rights violations. Once a powerful community leader, now stripped of everything. Where is Karen Holloway now, living in a motel? And just like that, the Queen of Oak Ridge had lost her kingdom. The rain had stopped. The cemetery was quiet now, the storm having passed, leaving the air thick with the scent of wet earth and fading flowers. Malik Carter stood at his brother's grave, staring down at the fresh soil that covered Jamal's casket. His fists clenched at his sides, his chest tight. It had been days since the funeral was interrupted. Days since Karen Holloway had him dragged away in handcuffs. Now he was free. Karen was the one behind bars. The HOA was gone, and Oak Ridge would never be the same again. But none of it brought Jamal back. A gentle hand rested on his shoulder. Elijah Carter. His father hadn't said much since the court ruling, but he didn't need to. His presence was enough. Malik swallowed hard, then reached into his pocket. A folded letter. Jamal's letter. His brother had written it a few weeks before his death. Malik had been too afraid to open it. Until now. Malik's fingers trembled as he unfolded the paper. His brother's handwriting stared back at him. Malik, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. It means I won't be there to keep you in check, to tell you when you're acting like a fool, or to remind you that you're the smartest kid I've ever known. You always hated this place, and I get it. I did too. But you're bigger than this town, bigger than their rules, their hate. I need you to promise me something. Don't let them break you. Don't let them tell you who you are. Be loud, be fearless, be the man you're meant to be. I love you, little bro. Jamal. Malik's breath hitched. He blinked rapidly, swallowing down the lump in his throat. His father said nothing. Just let the silence settle. Malik kneeled down, placing the letter against the headstone. He didn't cry. Instead, he whispered, I got justice for you, Jamal. I promise. I won't stop. Then he stood, squared his shoulders, and walked away. Across town, in a tiny motel room, Karen Holloway sat alone. The walls were bare, the furniture cheap. The air smelled of mildew and broken dreams. This was all she had left. Her mansion, gone. Her power, gone. Her reputation, ruined. She had spent years building a kingdom of fear, controlling everything, everyone. And now she was just another nobody. She clutched her phone with trembling fingers, scrolling through news articles, desperate to find a way out. Ex-HOA president faces civil rights lawsuit. Karen Holloway evicted from former home. Once powerful, now forgotten. A single tear slipped down her cheek. For the first time in her life, she had no control. No one feared her anymore. And that was the worst punishment of all. As Malik and Elijah left the cemetery, the sun finally broke through the clouds. Malik took a deep breath, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. For the first time, he wasn't just surviving. He was free. Justice had been served. And Karen Holloway? She was nothing but a bad memory now.